got a topic here to address that is philosophical but brief. I had a message that I believe was from a Patreon supporter asking me basically about, in principle, everything we have to say about animal rights and ideal or optimal treatment of animals. Put it that way. Everything we have to say about the optimal treatment of animals is based on human beings looking at animals and then human beings imposing onto those animals human expectations, human values, human feelings, right? That in some sense, fundamentally, when we look at how animals live and how we best could treat them, we're thinking about how we would feel if we were in those circumstances. Mutatis mutandis. So with necessary changes. Obviously, if you look at a dolphin that's in a tiny swimming pool, you can't say, well, if I were in that swimming pool, how would I feel? If you're looking at how whales and dolphins are treated, that's one thing. When we're looking at a monkey living its whole life in a cage, it seems pretty easy for us to make the leap of inference that that monkey would be happier if it weren't alone, if it were with a group of monkeys, if it had a bigger cage, if it had trees it could climb on within its cage, etc., etc. But all of this line of reasoning, doesn't it rely on the human observer imposing human values onto the monkey, onto the animal in question, whether it's a mammal or an insect or otherwise? So, this person writes to me, I'm probably going to have to skip some parts of this letter, it's a long letter. Eisel, I've been long aware of people who would argue that pet ownership was morally wrong, but I've regarded this position as ridiculous and never bothered seeking out more information. If this accomplishes nothing else, thank you for your videos on the topic. I'm not sure where I stand, but I now realize it's ethically important, and I realize the need to be more open-minded in the future. I'm having difficulty with reaching a conclusion, as it seems impossible to consider the issue without anthropomorphizing the pet. I'm so glad I managed to pronounce the word anthropomorphizing without stumbling on it. This is in the class of words you don't have a lot of practice saying out loud. The mainstream opinion, a la unnatural vegan, is given that the animal's needs are met, owning a pet is morally good, or at least morally neutral. I, too, found this convincing for a long time, because if I were going to be transformed into a dog, I would much rather have somebody filling my bowl than being obligated to forage for food. You, on the other hand, if I understand you correctly, believe that giving the dog the opportunity to fully realize the exercise of its instincts, its body and mind, involves letting it fend for itself among other dogs in the wild, and to deny it this opportunity is immoral. Perhaps this is the truth, but it doesn't seem to escape putting human characteristics onto dogs, although you're imposing another personality type. Yours. You so often speak of living a meaningful life, and whether you're a dog or a human, that seems impossible if someone else is making choices for you. Given that we can't communicate with animals to determine what their thoughts are on these matters, how are we supposed to know the right thing to do? How do we know animals' preferences or rights without projecting our preferences onto them? Don't you feel that your own personality, my personality, influences your beliefs on this issue? Okay, so that is an interesting and philosophical question from Max. It's interesting and it's philosophical. I also think it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant in two ways, the first of which I'll say really briefly, because I think everyone watching this is already vegan. The first sense in which it's irrelevant, you guys already know. We don't need to get into this level of sympathetic and speculative understanding of an animal's perspective of the world to come to the conclusion that a cow does not want to live its whole life in a tiny metal and concrete cage to produce milk for human beings, to then be slaughtered and cut up and consumed as meat. So that's one sense, and that's not, obviously I'm not using this to snub him, but in terms of veganism as a social movement, our opposition to the dairy industry doesn't get into these fine points of distinction. The second sense in which it's irrelevant, I think, is that he's making the error of continuing to think of animals as pets, as ineluctably, as intrinsically, inevitably, as playing the role of being the court jester for human beings, as existing for our entertainment and so on. When you start with this paradigm, even though he's examining it, even though he's questioning it here, you're thinking of pets in the role of your house guest. You're thinking, what should I do to make my guest comfortable? right? Which is natural. I completely understand why you think of animals that way, given that for many people in the modern world living in a city, the main role you see animals in is as our house guests, is as living in your house but not cooking for themselves, not paying the rent, not contributing in terms of production, which they did, of course, in medieval and pre-modern societies. So you see yourself as the role of the good host, and then you're questioning only the morality of how a good host should treat his or her house guest. My perspective, instead, is to look at the wilderness as a foreign country. It isn't truly, but to look at the wilderness as almost a foreign country, as something that has its own borders, something that has its own integrity, something that exists separately from our own sense of hospitality, of making people comfortable, what have you. I'm not concerned with the animal's comfort. I'm not concerned with the animal's desires. I'm not concerned with the animal's happiness. I'm not concerned with what that animal would choose. So, one of the most absurd examples, but I actually debated this with Mod Vegan, and I've seen a couple other vegans on YouTube talking about this. I do not think it's the role of human beings to interfere when one bear in the forest tries to eat another bear. Bears do engage in aggressive cannibalism. Bears kill and eat other bears. And it's brutal and horrifying. And even if you've watched a lot of nature documentaries, you may have never seen that. It's just a side of how bears really live that humans don't want to generally look at or face up to. So, if you actually believe the bears are part of our society, and you see one bear trying to eat another, do you call the police? If you see bears as your pets, as your house guests, if you have two bears in a zoo, it's immoral to put two bears together and have them fight to the death and eat each other for human entertainment. To have a gladiator's ring for bears, sure. But I'm not talking about the zoo. I'm not talking about, the dog that lives as your house guest. I'm talking about the integrity of those bears living on their own terms, killing on their own terms, and dying on their own terms in the wilderness. And thus the wilderness is something that stands apart from the morality of the good host, as instead something where our role is to maintain that border. First and foremost, human beings have to stop other human beings from cutting down the trees. We have to stop other human beings from hunting the bears. We have to maintain that preserve. And then, as I've said a million times, I don't believe in nature red in tooth and fang. I do believe that ultimately we are talking about wildlife management. That ultimately there are human beings who are concerned with, is the population of bears too high or too low or what have you. So within that, in a sense you're right. You could say, am I just someone who values independence? Am I just someone who values dignity? I think dignity is really the crucial not even independence. What I value is dignity. And my concept of dignity is probably not the same as your concept of dignity. I think there can be dignity in a wild animal starving to death, instead of, being castrated, domesticated, broken, and eating every meal out of the palm of a human hand. I think there's dignity in a dog or a wild boar living in the forest on its own terms, and that we are depriving the animal of that dignity when we reduce it to being a decoration on our carpet. You've heard me say these things before. So yes, my concept of dignity is ultimately a human-created concept. It's something that reflects my character, and it's true, I'm projecting it. But I would say that I'm projecting it mostly in how I construe this argument in trying to convince you. That's the main function of my psychology here, is in how I'm expressing myself when talking to other vegans. It is not really part of how I look at animals, feel about animals, understand how I would treat a domesticated dog in my own house if I was in that situation or what have you. So, you're right. It's an interesting point. I also think the point is of very limited validity for the two reasons I've already stated. This kind of wanting to look into the mind of an animal and understand from that animal's perspective what it would enjoy, that's only relevant if you're starting from assuming the role of human beings as being the good host, taking care of a house guest. What would my guest prefer? And it's not relevant when you realize our role is not to know that. I don't want to hook up dogs to an MRI scanner and figure out what makes them happier. And I've literally had vegans suggest to me that that's going to be the future for veganism, is understanding animal desires that way. No, the point is exactly to recognize, not to impose my human nature onto them, but to recognize that dog and dog nature, pig and pig nature, bear and bear nature are things we preserve, things we should value, things we should care about. But the main way we have to value them is exactly by allowing those animals to seek out their own livelihood in the wild, And they may find it, and they may fail to find it. They may starve to death. And of course, they wouldn't prefer to starve to death. But we're making a judgment based on the integrity of the wilderness itself, not based on the happiness of any particular bear. And as soon as you cross the line to go the other way, which I think we do, I think we will do inevitably, I think you'll find in the wilderness a bear that has one broken leg. And you have to make the decision, do we leave this bear to now die in the wild, or do we amputate the leg, take it to a zoo or take it to a circus, and give it a second life where it's just a plaything for human beings? Take it to the circus, castrate it, cut off its leg, give it $1 million worth of veterinary care, and then what? You're going to try to make that money back, I guess, by making a spectacle out of this three-legged bear. I understand. And sometimes people are sincerely compassionate when they see that. They say, this is a bear that could live another 10 years or something if we intervene. I completely understand that. I think there are vegans who have big hearts and they want to do exactly that. There are vegans who would get up out of their seat right now. They're so moved by thinking about a three-legged bear, and they would want to adopt that bear or keep it in their backyard or what have you. But it's trouble. And bears are not vegan. If you take that bear into your care, now you're into killing cows to feed your bear. Now you're into speciesism. And now you're actually into what I see as a terrible downward spiral of domestication of animals. Because as soon as you deprive that bear of its dignity, as soon as you deprive that bear of the possibility of living on its own terms and of dying on its own terms, you're taking it into human society. You're making it into a plaything instead of letting it live and die as an animal.